Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Fiveable, or welcome back to Fiveable, depending upon how much experience you've had with Fiveable. I'm Dr. Mole. I am a psychology teacher here at Cheltenham High School in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I am was not the original scheduled person for this evening. Because Allison Powell, I think, was scheduled for tonight originally, but then due to something came up and I was not able to present this evening, so that's why I'm here instead. I do teach AP Psychology. I've streamed for Fiveable before. Some of you may have seen me before. Haven't been here since the fall, and in these very odd times that we're having right now, I want to be sure that we are, I'll be here to help prepare students as best I can. So tonight we are going to be talking with, the topic is a review of other disorders. And specifically, we're going to look at schizophrenia, personality disorders, the insanity defense, which is not a disorder, it's a legal term. It's not even a psychological term. I mean, it is used in psychology, but it's not in the DSM. So I'm not even sure that word even appears in print in the DSM. So I'm just kind of looking around, making myself, familiarizing myself again with all the things. But if you have questions, you can ask in the chat. You can also, I believe, ask a question towards the bottom of the screen. So first of all, just a quick check here. Can someone say in the chat, can they see or hear me? Or hopefully both. Someone, anyone. Excellent. Very good. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so hopefully this will come up very soon. Let's see here. And we're going to share that now. All right. So, oops, I am not at the right place here, so I'm going to start from there. All right. So do you see right now the title? It should see you should see this thing that says Fiveable and Psych Clinical Other Disorders 317 at 8 p.m. with John Mole. Excellent. Very good. So I'll make sure that I have that all there. If you have questions as I go along, please ask them in the chat. It's a little clunky the way they have this set up, where I can ask or I can kind of go through my presentation, but I can't easily see the chat at the same time. I see already have a question here. Heritability. I will get to heritability towards the end, and if I don't get to that, make sure you call me out towards the end of this. But yeah, heritability. It is a fair game question. So, but I will get to that a little later on. So, all right. So, all right, here we go. So, moving on here to the next slide. We're always supposed to plug our social media. That thing Fiveable. So, there it is on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Actually, no, it's Facebook and Instagram. Sorry, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. It's very hard to keep track of all these social media accounts. So anyway, what are we talking about tonight? Tonight, we are going to look at schizophrenia and its causes, something called the Diathesis-Stress Model, personality disorders, and the insanity defense. I did mention that already. So I want to make sure I get into a little bit more detail there. So, all right, here we go. First off, schizophrenia. The funny thing about schizophrenia is that it means split brain. And when you look at the breakdown of the word, and people often think of it as dissociative identity disorder. Now, once upon a time, people who had what we call today dissociative identity disorder were called or were said to have schizophrenia. In other words, this person has schizophrenia, or they'd use the term schizophrenic, which is a term we don't like to use today, but they might have said that in 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. A person who has these multiple personalities, but it is not. As a matter of fact, we now think that, or I should say there are some who even actually think that having dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia is, first of all, it's exceptionally rare for that to happen. And then some would say it's not even possible, that the processes involved in both are so different that there are some people who actually hold that belief. But for our purposes, understand that schizophrenia is not the same as dissociative identity disorder. Sometime in the early 2000s, I want to say 2005, 2006, I forget the exact year, there was an entire FRQ on schizophrenia and what were some misconceptions about schizophrenia. And one of them was that, well, it's not the same as dissociative identity disorder. A person with schizophrenia does not have multiple personalities. They do not have, a person with that disorder wouldn't have the type of dissociation that would lead to dissociative identity disorder. So understand that the schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder are not the same thing, because it's one of those questions that could ask in the AP exam where they describe schizophrenia or they describe dissociative identity disorder and say, which disorder is this? And they give both as options. And you want to make sure that you know which one is which in this case. You want to know which one is, you can differentiate the two. And really, so long as you understand that dissociative identity disorder is specifically talking about the multiple personalities, the strong amounts of dissociation, escaping reality, or trying to handle situations, or trying to cope in a way by becoming a different person, which is really oversimplifying the disorder there, and the process of it is not the same as schizophrenia. If they talk about hallucinations, they talk about delusions, they talk about flat affect, that is much more indicative of schizophrenia than it would be dissociative identity disorder. As a matter of fact, those are not the symptoms of dissociative identity disorder. So understand the difference there between the two. So given that, let's talk about this dissociative identity disorder stuff. So I do my slides differently. I don't give the here's the term and a whole bullet list of things. I don't like doing that. I actually like to do spreadsheets. I like to do charts. I like to do mind maps, different things there. So, I'm also looking at the question, psychosis is a symptom. All right, I'll get to that a little later on. Again, if I don't get to that, make sure you follow up on that. So schizophrenia, when we talk about schizophrenia here, it's in some ways one of the oldest disorders. It's a term that a lot of people don't even like the term anymore, but it's so historically, it's been around for so long that people just prefer using that term. So maybe in the next DSM, maybe in DSM-6, DSM-7, there will be no schizophrenia. They'll call it something else. But schizophrenia, first off, let's talk about the actual symptoms behind schizophrenia. First of all, modern psychology likes to talk about in terms of the positive and negative symptoms. When we say positive and negative, it's really important to understand that we are not talking about good and bad. When we talk about positive and negative, it has nothing to do with good. Negative does not mean bad in this case. If you've done the learning unit where you talk about operant conditioning and positive and negative reinforcements and positive and negative punishments, they don't mean good and bad. When we talk about positive, a positive symptom means it's the presence of a behavior or the presence of something that, to simplify it, should not be there or should not be to that extreme. So when we say positive, means it's something that's there, something that appears, something that manifests, something that shows up. And if you could remember that makes positive and negative reinforcements go into the learning unit much easier to understand. When we talk about negative, we're talking about the absence of a behavior, the absence of emotion, the absence of something that ought to be there. And it does not mean bad. Now, so when a person has positive symptoms, schizophrenia, how could there be good symptoms of schizophrenia? Well, we're not talking about good in this case. When we talk about positive, I mean the presence of something. And that's something that we have to make sure that we really understand, know the difference between a positive and negative symptom. So, and we're going to talk about some of these positive and negative symptoms here. So one of the first symptoms of, and I should say that a person with schizophrenia does not necessarily have all of these symptoms. As a matter of fact, it's almost unheard of to have all of them, all of the symptoms. In the old DSM, they used to differentiate different types of schizophrenia: paranoid schizophrenia, catatonic schizophrenia. But here, they don't do that anymore. It's just one big category of schizophrenia. So with hallucinations, the hallucination by definition is perception without sensation. In other words, it is hearing something, seeing something that is not actually there. So if I hear voices in my mind, it doesn't, then these voices are not there. I am having an auditory hallucination. I am perceiving sound, even though my sensory organs, in this case, the basilar membrane in my cochlea of my ears, are not actually picking up on sound waves that would correspond to those voices. So in other words, I'm perceiving something that's not actually there. I'm hearing something that's not there. I'm seeing something that's not there. Historically, most symptoms of schizophrenia are auditory. It is, as a matter of fact, when a person has an auditory hallucination, it is almost, actually I don't know the percentages, but it's almost overwhelmingly, I would say, an auditory hallucination. Visual hallucinations do occur usually in distorted visual ways, like something doesn't seem right or something seems a little strange, or when I say that, meaning it doesn't seem like it's the real thing. But this idea that a person could see a dead relative talking to them in great detail is rather rare. As a matter of fact, if a person's presenting that, a doctor or a psychiatrist would probably actually have that person get a neurological assessment to see that there's nothing, there's no tumors or there's nothing neurologically wrong that might be causing that, because the idea of having that type of symptomology, a visual hallucination, is exceptionally rare in schizophrenia. So hallucinations. Delusions are a second thing, and I will tell you that some test bank questions, I'm not sure if it's appeared on the AP exam itself, but it is a favorite question of teachers to ask, where they try and make sure you differentiate delusions from hallucinations. A delusion is a belief. So whereas a hallucination is a perceptual experience, a delusion is a belief. It's an odd or irrational belief that persists even in the face of contradictory evidence. In other words, I might believe something so bizarre or strange, and yet, given any evidence that's presented to me, that belief still persists. So I might believe that the aliens are coming down. The aliens are coming down, and they're going to, as a matter of fact, that they're secretly transmitting mind control signals through the airwaves, through Wi-Fi. And so we have to be wary of that. And maybe you could show me evidence that there are no aliens, that aliens are not coming down to Earth. And yet I still continue to believe that. I still believe that, or I will continue to believe that in spite of the contradictory evidence. I might believe that I am President Obama, let's say. I'm President Obama, and you could have President Obama show up right in front of me, and yet I still will believe, in spite of the fact that President Obama is standing right there, that I will have that delusion. These illusions are very, very strong. There was a very famous study that was done, and I forget exactly when, but it was like in the 50s, I think, where there were three men. And I'm kind of doing this from my recollection here, so some of the details might be a little fuzzy, but there were three men. Each of them thought that he was Jesus Christ. And so the idea was, if you brought them all in the same room and they saw the unusual ideas presented by the other two, that each person would kind of just drop the belief. Well, it turned out it made their beliefs much stronger, because not only did they believe that each one thought that he was Jesus Christ, it actually solidified their belief, because they saw two people who were clearly faking. Oh, that's clearly someone faking it. That's clearly someone faking it. So it continued to actually persist. So these delusions might persist in spite of the fact that there's contradictory evidence. And by the way, to be clear, a person could have a hallucination, a person could have a delusion, but not be schizophrenia. We'll make sure that's clear. It's a collection of different symptomologies here. So, all right, the next one is paranoia. Paranoia is kind of an odd or irrational anxiety. Usually this idea that you're being watched or you're being followed. You feel like all eyes are on you. You feel like all eyes are, there's people watching you. A person might say that might think the government is looking after us or something like that. And again, there are people who don't have schizophrenia that could have that type of paranoia, and there are other who don't have psychological disorders, and there are people who have certain types of psychological disorders that are not schizophrenia, that but would still have paranoia. But it doesn't mean it's schizophrenia necessarily. So a person might say, "Well, the government's watching us," or I think my family's out to get me. Like those are some statements they might say. A person who's having paranoia as part of schizophrenia. And again, like I said, paranoia could be part of other disorders too, but here with reference to schizophrenia. Okay, another one is inappropriate emotions. So imagine a person going to, let's say, a funeral, and they might laugh, or they might think it's funny or something like that. And sometimes a person might be so overwhelmed with stress or something like that, they might laugh. That's not what I'm talking about. Where they there's a certain situation where you're expected to be a certain type of emotion, or one should feel a certain type of emotion, but they're doing something that's inappropriate for it. So a person might be laughing and think it's very funny while they're supposed to be in a very sad situation, such as a funeral, or maybe a place where everyone's happy and they are very, very upset. They're very sad, or they're very angry. Those could be a type of inappropriate. When I say inappropriate, not congruent to the actual situation that's there. So, all right, and disorganized thoughts and speech. This is where a person might have a series of just different thoughts kind of running through their mind, just like so many different things. Could be auditory, kind of a mixture of the auditory hallucinations of voices, maybe screaming in their head, or just like these different things. Like, okay, I'm thinking about this, then this, then this, and this, and this. Very difficult to keep things straight, and it might manifest in their speech where they're talking in what's sometimes called a word salad, where they're just saying just different words or different phrases, or they start off with one thought and then they segue to another thought and another thought, another thought, another thought, and with just kind of like in a sequence here, and it's very hard to follow along. So that's when we talk about the disorganized thoughts. That's what we mean by that. So that's another positive symptom of schizophrenia. Now, a negative symptom, again, when we talk about negative, we're talking about the lack of something that's not there, something that maybe should be there but is not. Catatonia is a classic negative symptom of schizophrenia. In catatonia, essentially, in its classic definition, it's a lack of movement. A person, they're completely catatonic, they are completely motionless. A person with schizophrenia might have very restricted motion, might have very resistant motion. They might be very, very slow or very jerky in their movements, trying to move. Sometimes they might assume a position where they're just kind of holding it, let's say like this, and they might hold it for several hours. That's something that could happen. Sometimes it's you try to move the arm and they try to move it in a different way. So it's a lack of movement, and sometimes no movement at all. So next one is flat affect. Flat affect is a very fancy way of saying no emotion whatsoever, a lack of emotion. Affect with an A refers to emotion or emotional expression. So a person who, consider a poker face. If you know what that is, a poker face, a person playing poker, you're seeing your opponent, but you have no idea what they're thinking. You have no idea if they're happy or sad. The face is just shows no emotion whatsoever. That is a flat affect. So that is a type of negative symptom that can occur. So when you look at it, why are the positive symptoms positive? You can see things that are there that probably should not be there. Whereas the negative symptoms, things that are not there, for example, no movement, no emotion, those would be negative symptoms. So that's why I like to talk about the negative versus the positive. Whether or not the AP exam gets into differentiating positive from negative, I have not seen, But those general symptoms overall, or those specific symptoms, I should say, could be very much fair game. So what causes schizophrenia? So two possible causes of schizophrenia. One is high dopamine levels. You might recall dopamine is associated with pleasurable feelings of happiness, but it also has some other things too. Does anybody remember? Let's see if I can, if anybody remembers in the chat. Low levels of dopamine are associated with what? It could be with a bunch of things, but there's one classic one in Psych. Does anybody remember the low dopamine levels? See if anybody remembers that. Low dopamine levels. And if I said dopamine also helps us with controlled movement, Parkinson's disease, that's right, Parkinson's disease. So when we talk about low levels of dopamine associated with Parkinson's, high levels of dopamine associated with schizophrenia. Notice, and I have to admit, I use the term possible causes because these are correlates. In other words, we see these things, we observe them, and that people with schizophrenia tend to have high levels of dopamine. Now, does that mean the high levels of dopamine are actually causing the schizophrenia? Maybe, but we can't be exactly sure. Having said that, though, there are medications where they attempt to lower the dopamine levels, and as a result, the symptoms do seem to relieve a bit, or people do have some symptom relief. So maybe it's a cause. But we do know that high dopamine levels are associated with schizophrenia. Also, enlarged brain vesicles. Vesicle, you might recall that term in the bio unit, where the terminal button has those synaptic vesicles that hold the neurotransmitters that release in the synaptic cleft. Maybe you'll learn that, maybe not, but they're called synaptic vesicles. A vesicle is basically a gap or a space. And our brain has 4 vesicles in it, these gaps in our brain that hold the fluid in there. And and it turns out that, it seems at least, that people with schizophrenia tend to have larger brain vesicles. Now, again, is that causing it, or does that just happen to be a thing that's associated with it? We don't know, but we do know that's associated with it. We do know that there's a genetic component to schizophrenia. We do know that, and I don't have this on the slide itself, the percentage of the incidence rate of schizophrenia is 1%, which is another way of saying is in a person's lifetime, 1% of the population, among everyone's lifetime, will have schizophrenia. So that is that's the 1%. We know it probably has a genetic component to it. If one parent has schizophrenia, depending upon some of the data exactly is not, it varies depending upon the study that you read, but about 10% chance if one parent has schizophrenia, that a person will have schizophrenia as well. And if 2 parents have schizophrenia, then there's a 50% chance a person will have schizophrenia. We do know that in twin studies that if one monozygotic twin, so one identical twin, has schizophrenia, I believe it's a 50% chance if the other twin also has schizophrenia. So there's definitely a strong component to schizophrenia. So moving on here. So something else we have to understand about schizophrenia, and it's not just schizophrenia, but it's often associated with schizophrenia. It's called the Diathesis-Stress Model. The Diathesis-Stress Model is a model that kind of suggests, does a person get schizophrenia? Is it environmental or is it biological? Well, the answer is always going to be both. There's always going to be, every disorder is probably going to have some biological component to it, and then genetic predisposition to it as well. So the Diathesis-Stress Model suggests in this chart, as fancy as it, or not fancy as it might look, or as complicated as it might look, that a person with a genetic predisposition, a high genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, would have, how much would schizophrenia, let's say, manifest? Well, depends upon the environmental stressors. So if a person has a very high genetic predisposition to schizophrenia, but they've had low stressors, they were raised in a nurturing environment with parents who were there for them to give them what they needed, to give emotional support, good education. In those instances, they maybe the schizophrenia doesn't actually manifest. Maybe it doesn't actually come out. Maybe they live a life free of any symptoms, but maybe it manifests in different ways. Maybe they kind of think of things in an odd or unusual way. We call that schizotopy or schizotypy. I've heard both pronunciations, where a person kind of thinks in an unusual way, and that's actually not a bad thing, because to think creatively, we all need to think in a new way. To be creative, it's thinking in a new way. So schizotopy or schizotypy is a very good thing to have. And so maybe that genetic predisposition kind of plays itself out in spite of the fact that there are no environmental stressors. Maybe it plays itself out in a not bad or perhaps good way. But let's say, on the other hand, a person does have high genetic predisposition and also a very high stressor, so not enriching environment, lots of stressors, trauma maybe, then they'll manifest in a very sort of severe way, where the symptoms are very bad. They are debilitating, and a person has a difficulty with living their lives. So, but it's a continuum. So how much of the disorder kind of manifests, it depends upon how much genetic predisposition there is. If a person has, pardon me, relatively low environment or genetic predisposition, but high stressors, even though there's only a little bit of that genetic predisposition, maybe it's enough that with a very stressful environment, symptoms start to manifest. That's the idea behind the Diathesis-Stress Model. It's an interaction between genetic predisposition and environmental stressors. So it usually is most closely associated with schizophrenia, although it can be used with other disorders too. So, all right. Again, if you have questions, feel free to ask them in the Ask a Question feature or in the chat, and I will definitely get to them a little later on. So, personality disorders. Personality disorders in the old days, here I'm talking about in the old days, personality disorders whereas a lot of the other disorders we've talked about, or that you have talked about in other courses or in your course, maybe in previous streams, they kind of come and go in episodes. In other words, a person doesn't have schizophrenia 24/7. They have bouts. They have maybe, let's say they have hallucinations. They have times when they're hallucinating and having delusions, and there are times when they're not. There are times when a person with major depressive disorder has bouts of depression, and times when they do not. A person with bipolar disorder may have bouts of depression, bouts of manic episodes, and times when there's neither. Same thing, with just about every other disorder. But the personality disorders kind of have a different approach here. Here, it's about behaviors that are an enduring pattern and pervasive and inflexible. So here, it's almost like either the disordered way of living. It is just persistent throughout one's life. It's not it's just the way that they live their lives might be disordered. That's the idea behind the personality disorders. It doesn't mean that everything they do is wrong. That's not what I mean. It does not mean that everything they do is disordered or bad. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a pattern of behavior that is affecting their lives in some way that is it's affecting their lives in a very negative way. Negative in this case meaning bad. It's stable over time, and it deviates from cultural expectations. So it's one where it's inflexible, it's affecting their life in a bad sort of way or a not pleasant sort of way. And here, loosely, it is affecting cultural expectations. What do I mean by that? For example, histrionic personality disorder, we all will have emotions from time to time. Times will be very close and very distant, times when we may have mood swings, but not so quickly, not so sudden, not so unpredictably as a person with histrionic personality disorder might have. I'll get to that in just a little bit. Now, some teachers only teach, let's say, 5 personality disorders. I actually go into all, gosh, I keep forgetting the count, 12 or 13, and only because most, at least half, the term defines itself. If you know what the term is, then you can kind of figure out what it is, and so they're not very hard to remember in that case. They might appear as distractors. So, for example, they'll have histrionic personality disorder as the correct answer on the AP exam, and one of the incorrect answers might be, I don't know, schizotypal personality disorder or schizoid personality disorder. And just being familiar with it would tell you that that's not going to be the correct answer. So, all right. Let's, and I forgot functional impairment, which is a hallmark of any disorder. So it's functional impairment of behaviors persistent throughout one's life. All right. There's actually 3 clusters, the DSM defines it, and I'm sorry that got very strangely worded like that, and I got kind of blocked off in a way like that. But the clusters you don't have to memorize. I don't think they'll ask you which disorder is in cluster A or cluster B. I just present it in the 3 clusters. So if you just, if it helps you to kind of categorize them, this cluster as the odd or eccentric, as they're called in DSM, go for it. And if not, fine. But I just leave it here for your information. If it does appear on the AP exam, a lot of students are not going to know it. So paranoid personality disorder, it's the same thing as paranoia with schizophrenia. Whereas again, schizophrenia, a person might have bouts of paranoia. Here, a person is living in constant paranoia, where there's someone watching me, is someone looking after me, is someone watching every step that I do, is the government bugging the system. That's paranoid personality disorder. So the next one, schizoid. Schizoid personality disorder, it describes someone who has no desire whatsoever for any type of social interaction. They don't have friends, and they don't care if they have friends. They prefer it that way. They live by themselves, or they're happy to live by themselves, be left alone, don't want to talk to anyone. They have no desire for romance or even sexual relationships. They might distance themselves from the family. Again, and I should say that these are textbook presentations here. If you know anyone who's a therapist, they'll tell you that sometimes it's not so clear cut. And the reason why you need to be trained in therapy is because you're trained to do therapy is because you have to know how to differentiate very subtle behaviors. And so not everyone with schizoid personality disorder is going to be to this extreme. I mean, there are people with schizoid personality disorder who do interact with people, who do have friends, but maybe prefer not to, or rather just be kept to themselves. So, but from a textbook perspective, there's no desire for social interaction whatsoever. They just don't want to talk to people. And I'm emphasizing that because it's going to be very similar to something else a little later on. The next one's called schizotypal. Now, don't ask me who was the genius decided to have 2 personality disorders with very similar names that are both similar to schizophrenia, but are not schizophrenia. But it is what it is. Schizotypal personality disorder is eccentric thinking. When we say eccentric, we're talking about like very much out of the box, odd or bizarre ways of thinking and behaving. They might, they might have the ideas about the aliens coming down, or thinking they have special magical powers or healing capabilities, or believe in telepathy or clairvoyance. And there are people who believe in that, but don't necessarily have schizotypal personality disorder, to be clear about that. But it's this eccentric thinking. So it's not the same as schizoid. Schizotypal is this very odd or unusual way of thinking. So that's schizotypal. And if you know what schizotypy is, or schizotypy, then this schizotypal becomes pretty easy to remember. So cluster B is the dramatic, emotional, or erratic. And these are terms that are coming straight from DSM. These are not my descriptors. Antisocial, there are some people who use this term incorrectly in psychology. When we talk about antisocial personality disorder, we are not talking about someone who is trying to keep to themselves. They're not talking about someone who's trying to be alone. They're not talking about someone who is a loner or is afraid to talk to people. They're not talking about that at all. When we talk about antisocial personality disorder, this is someone who, again, in the textbook presentation of it, has no regard for the rights of others. They show no empathy for others. Again, we're talking about textbook presentation here. They don't show remorse for their actions. They could lie. They could be deceitful. They could be very clever in their lying, in their deceit. The people who are serial killers most likely would meet the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. They don't show the same type of emotional warmth that the typical person would. And again, like I said, everything else, every disorder is in a continuum. So not everyone's going to have the extreme forms. There are people with antisocial personality disorder who have families, but they don't have the same type of connectiveness, emotional connectiveness that the average person might have. So that's what antisocial personality disorder is. Okay. Next one is borderline personality disorder. This is a person who, where there's a border between being very, very close and loving and being very distant and almost resentful. So on one hand, they might be very close to a person. I love you so much. I want to be with you. You mean everything to me. And then almost on the turn of a dime, they say, I don't want to get away from me. I don't like you. I hate you. Pardon me. That's why they call it borderline. They're kind of on that border. And it's just this very abrupt emotional shifts where suddenly they might lash out in anger over things that one might not should not be angry about. So the example I like to tell my students is about someone who was doing therapy. It was a group therapy session, and one of the people had borderline personality disorder, and this person's coffee order was incorrect, and the person like there was too much sugar or something like that, and the person threw the coffee at the person who made the coffee, saying, "You didn't make my coffee right." And, most people, you should expect that the typical person would be upset or whatever, or I'll just go make my own coffee, but not have that much of a reaction to it. That's borderline personality disorder. Histrionic personality disorder is attention-seeking behavior, very typically flirtatious. There's a need for approval. It's like, please, I love you. Look at me. I love you so much. And if you're away from me, I can't stand this. Now, notice that there's a subtle difference between that and borderline. Borderline is the close then distant, and abrupt change of emotions. Whereas with histrionic, it is, if you know what the word histrionic means, it kind of means like overly emotional. And that's what the person with histrionic personality disorder would have. They are just very, very, please look at me, don't go away from me, please don't go. And because they might show that extreme emotion. They might not take criticism very well, but if I give a constructive criticism, like, you misspelled this word, or the word order was incorrect, and they might say, I'll never get this, I'll never be good at this. That's the idea behind histrionic personality disorder. Again, not everyone's going to be like that. These are the textbook presentations, but that is the general idea behind histrionic personality disorder. Narcissistic. If you are familiar with the Greek story of Narcissus, who fell in love with his reflection, and there's two versions of the story. It was in a pond of water or something like that, and he wanted to be so close to the reflection he fell in and he drowned. Another one was he was so enamored by it he just couldn't look away and he starved to death. There's variations of that story, but it's this idea of having extreme self-importance. It's where a person they kind of they want the attention on them. They put themselves on a pedestal. It's like, hey, look at me. My accomplishments are good. Yours, not so much. Everyone should take notice of what I'm doing. I'm important. You're not. That is the idea behind narcissistic personality disorder. If you know the story of Narcissus, then it should be pretty easy to kind of remember that one. Then the third cluster is anxious and fearful. And this one's called obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is not obsessive compulsive disorder. This is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is one that probably won't appear as the correct choice on the AP exam, but one that could appear as a distractor. That is incorrect choice. I have no special information on that. That's just my speculation. But obsessive compulsive disorder, has anyone here ever seen My Fair Lady? Just a quick thing here in the chat. Has anyone here ever seen My Fair Lady? I should have, if I thought of this, I would put this as a question. If anyone's seen My Fair Lady, just give me a yes or something like that in the chat. Okay, so we got one person who's going to, so one person who has seen it, so two people. And the reason why I mention that is, I'll give an analogy very soon about, or a connection to that. Obsessive compulsive personality is a rigid way of living, hates change, does not like doing things differently. They have a very structured way of living their life. They might have a routine. They hate deviating from it. They are typically very frugal. They don't like spending money. They want to keep money to themselves, or not spend it at least. They do not like change at all. They're very conservative, not necessarily politically, but just very conservative in how they live their lives. They just do not like change. And the analogy I give is Henry Higgins, before he falls in love with Eliza Doolittle, kind of gave that, a very structured way of living his life. He often reminds me of someone who could have met the diagnostic criteria of obsessive compulsive disorder, personality disorder, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Of course, we should not be diagnosing anyone, in my opinion, even literary characters, unless you have the ability to diagnose. But even then, a person who would have that wouldn't be diagnosing literary characters. But that's the one that often, in terms of behaviors, best reminds me of that. Anyway, avoidant personality disorder is where one avoids social interactions. And you say, wait a minute, isn't that schizoid? The difference here, it's a subtle difference. Whereas with schizoid, they have no desire for social interaction, so they don't talk to people. Avoidant, they don't talk to people because they're afraid of rejection. They're afraid of being made fun of. They're afraid of ostracism. They're afraid of being looked at in an odd way, or being rejected. They want those relationships. They desperately want to have a relationship with other people. They desperately want to be with other people. They desperately want to have romantic relationships or a circle of friends, but they're afraid of being rejected. So they desperately want to be with the family member, or with friends or with other people, but they're afraid of rejection. So that's avoidant. So schizoid, they avoid people because they don't want to be with other people. Avoidant, they want to be with other people, but they're afraid of rejection. And finally, dependent. Dependent personality disorder refers to a person depending on someone else. Now, I don't want to parrot the term because that appears in FRQ. You don't want to say a person with dependent personality disorder depends on. It's kind of relying on someone else to do something for you. Now, maybe if let's say the photocopier jammed in the faculty lounge, and like, hey, do you know how to fix this? Can you fix this for me? Because I don't know how. Sure, the person says, I can do that for you. But what if a person comes and says, hey, can you make these copies for me? Because maybe they know how to do it, but they just need other people to do things for them, things that they should be able to do by themselves. Hey, can you tell me how to do this thing, or show me how to do this thing, or do this thing for me? I don't know how to do it, or maybe they do know how, but I kind of need you to do it for me. They don't have the initiative necessarily to do the things for themselves. They are relying on others. It's a reliance on other people to do things for them. They have difficulty making decisions, making choices. They might actually look to others to make the choices for them. If, for example, senior in high school might, gosh, I'm trying to think of all these colleges. Which college should I go to? That's a tough choice. A person with dependent personality disorder might actually ask someone to make the choice for them because they are afraid to make the choice for themselves. So that's dependent personality disorder. All right. The final major topic for this evening is the insanity defense. insanity is a not a psychological term. It's not something. No one is diagnosed in the DSM with insanity. Insanity is a legal term that is used in courts that will use psychologists and use psychology to determine it, but it's not a necessarily, it's not a diagnosis, it's not a psychological health disorder. It's a legal term in which the defense it uses. In other words, what happens here is the insanity defense. I don't have it best laid out here, but basically, the insanity defense essentially means, did the person at the time of committing a crime, were they aware of their actions? Were they were they in control of their actions? Were they able to differentiate right and wrong? Do they have a sense of morality? And that is something that the defense has to prove. Yeah, you might know in legal basics that the burden of proof for guilt refers to the prosecution. Well, if the defense wants to use the insanity plea, they have to prove that the person was legally insane at the time. And there's a very general principle called the Minoltan Rule that goes back several hundred years, I think, that basically says at the time of the crime, and I kind of talked about this already, was the person aware of what they were doing and aware of the difference between right and wrong when the crime was committed? And that is actually a very tough thing to prove, because you'd actually have to prove what someone was thinking, what was in their mindset in the past. And that's why it's very difficult to pull off. It is, a lot of people think, the insanity defense is used all the time. It's only used in about 1% of court cases. And in that instance, only successful maybe about a quarter of the time. So if you do the math right there, that means a very, very small percentage of court cases with a major crime. And it's not, you wouldn't use this defense for, taking candy from the candy store. We're talking about usually things like murder. That's, crimes of that gravity. And let's say you are successful in that defense. It doesn't mean, I'm sorry, this is cut off there again. It doesn't mean that you get to go scot-free. It means there's going to be forced hospitalization, where you are going to be treated typically by the state to whatever was causing a person to have that difficulty of knowing the difference between right and wrong. It's going to be treated in some way. And as it turns out, I think there was one study that showed that people who successfully pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity were typically spent, because after hospitalization, then there's going to be jail time. And that jail time might be lessened, or there might not be any jail time, but there could be jail time. So it turns out that put together, they typically would spend more time there than if they were if they had just pled guilty. It is, so like I said, it's a very, very difficult thing to pull off there, and you don't do it just to try to get things, to make your life easy. It's very, very hard to pull off. So that is it for this topic, for this presentation tonight. I do want to, I'm going to have some time for questions. I will get to the questions in a little bit. So I just want to give a quick plug, if I may. I'm doing development. I'm talking about development, early maturation, and growth, which is on March 19th at 1 p.m. This is open to anyone in the Fileable community. Whatever you we're doing different topics. We go all throughout here. I was doing development. I was doing clinical disorders today. I'll be doing development on Monday. Thursday. I'm losing track of my days here, it seems. So but that's at 1 p.m. Eastern time. 1 p.m. Eastern time. That would be, 10 a.m. Pacific. I can think. I can do math. I think I can. So so 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That'll be holding that presentation there. So questions. I'm going to get to the questions here now, and knowing that they were asked earlier, let's see, stir crazy, so my family, we've been taking walks to there's, it's not so that we're not in the house too long. We go for walks. All right, so there were questions about heritability. I'd actually have to look at the AP exam, the released AP exam, to see if there was an actual question about heritability. But as far as we teachers are concerned, we do say that is a fair game question. Heritability is, gosh, how do I explain this? Because heritability is very often misunderstood. It's something that in my own class, I probably spend 15 minutes discussing. And maybe it might be a question in the AP exam, but heritability means given the variation of a trait. So in this case, schizophrenia. Given that some people have schizophrenia, some people don't have schizophrenia, and that the symptomology of schizophrenia can vary. Given that variation, how much of that variation is due to environmental factors versus genetics? It's not how much of something is genetic, but how much of the variation within a population is genetic. And that's what heritability is. How much of it is genetic? And so I believe, if memory serves me correct, heritability of schizophrenia, I want to say it's 50%. I don't remember the exact number. I don't think that is a question in the AP exam, but because again, that number can vary from study to study. And on the AP exam, they want to ask something that's very, very clear. So, so hopefully that answers the question there. If you have further questions, Paul, about heritability, please let me know. Psychosis. Psychosis is an old term that I don't know if it originated with Freud or if it was like Charcot or Breuer, one of those people. With psychosis, it essentially means it's an old term that would mean like any type of mental health disorder by today's standards. It might mean a dissociative episode or delusions or something like that. So no, the DSM does not use psychosis as a symptom anywhere. It's kind of an old-fashioned term that might mean a type of mental health disorder manifestation. So, and Liz, if I'm saying correctly, if you have a further question, that please let me know. So, are there delusions of personalities in dissociative identity disorder? So this is Courtney's question. They're not delusions. They're not considered delusions because, well, let's put it this way. A person could have a personality where they believe themselves to be someone or have something or possess some trait that's definitely not of them. But that doesn't make it a delusion. They don't think of it as delusions. I wouldn't use delusions as a symptom in dissociative identity disorder. If dissociative identity disorder appears on the AP exam, on the FRQ, and you're using delusions, that could really that could really confuse a reader and not give you the point for it. So I wouldn't use mix up the term delusion with dissociative identity disorder. So. So this is Harry. You're welcome, Courtney. Harry or Hari, if I'm saying it correctly, please correct me. So here, this is not in context. So does it have any bias associated with it? If you could let me know which, you can reference that a little bit more, I'll be happy to answer that. So Kayla says, and you're welcome. Happy to do this. It is, I do enjoy doing this. I'm taking this class next year. So, well, I mean, I think you should take the class. I think you should pay attention. I think you should read. I think you're getting a good start. Let's put it that way. But just I would say that just doing the trivia is not going to guarantee you a 5. You should definitely take the class. I mean, so yeah. Okay. Are there other questions? So. Like I said, this was I had to put this together kind of the last minute. I mean, I took my actual slides that I use and I put them together for this evening. So, another question here. How much of the test is based on terms? That is, let's put it this way. They don't actually calculate that because a term comes with it maybe a name or an application or a type of concept or a schema, if you remember that from the cognition unit. So, for example, if you're talking about schizophrenia, well, okay, what would you need to know about schizophrenia? Well, by itself, that's a term, but that connects to dopamine. That connects to delusions, hallucinations. That could connect to positive and negative symptoms. I would say that if a person really knew all the terms, and I'm not just talking about going through flashcards and reciting back the definition, but just knowing the terms, then you kind of know everything. So I would say it's all of it's based on terms. A term might be associated with a name. So if I said, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of one offhand. I'm having difficulty. If I said misinformation effect, well, that's cognition. Well, that goes back to Elizabeth Loftus. And if you know Elizabeth Loftus and you really knew why or who Elizabeth Loftus is and why she's important, that would connect to, well, misinformation effect. So it's when we say knowing the term, it's not just reciting back the term, but really being able to understand the term. So to answer your question in so many words is basically very important. So which people do I believe will show up most commonly in the exam? That's a question that many teachers want to know. And I would, to answer that question, what I would say is the AP Psych course expectations or whatever. Let me see if I can find it here. AP course description. All right, let me take a look here. So what I'm going to do here is put in the chat. This is a public document here. So this is to Renee's question. And if I'm saying that wrong, please correct me on that. I apologize if I am. Oh, good. All right. So basically, it tells you these are the names you need to know. It basically within each unit. So we just did intelligence in my class, and we did so Galton and Terman and Benet. Those are names you might need to know. Like I don't have it all memorized. So that's what they say. Now, does that mean that there could be another name? I don't know, because this is a new exam this year. They changed around the exam format. But I would say you stick to those names. That's what you should know, or start with that. So you're quite welcome. Any other questions? I know these are very odd times, and College Board doesn't even know how this exam is going to work. They're kind of, I think they're scrambling. I don't know. I'm not working for College Board, and so it's hard to say what's going to happen. So I doubt that I would bet a lot of money that they're not going to hold people to that early May testing date. That's just my thought on it. So. My pleasure. And I hope to see you all on Thursday afternoon if you're available to talk about development and early maturation. So, yeah. Well, I'm going to end that now, folks. And with that, I thank you very much for showing up. And if you have questions, if you have requests especially, please put them, I think if you there's ways of suggesting this to Fiveable. Even if you tweeted it or did on social media, say, hey, I could really use a thing on this. There's a good chance that's going to happen. Please don't say, I could use a stream on the entire curriculum, because that's just not going to be helpful. But if you say, yeah, I could really use something on this, there's a good chance that will happen or will be addressed at some point. So, okay. Oh, would there be anything about coronavirus? I doubt it. As a matter of fact, I would bet the exam's already written. In other words, they've already got the questions. So I think that would, if they're doing it as a joke, I don't think many people are going to find it funny, to be honest. So, all right. Well, with that, folks, thank you again so much. It was great to be back here doing this again. It's been a while. So with that, folks, good luck. I'm sure I'm going to see a lot of you again in different chats, and have a great night. Take care.